Hello, my name is Dr. Fisher-Wikoff. I'm a family physician with Texas Healthcare, Privia Medical Group, North Texas, and I will be presenting Buying or Leasing Medical Office Space Curriculum for Physicians in conjunction with the Texas Academy of Family Physicians Leadership Experience. Let's begin. The objectives of this presentation is to learn the pros and cons of buying or renting medical office space, to define the terms that physicians need to know when purchasing or leasing office space, and to finally provide step-by-step instructions for the financial purchase of a medical office space or obtaining a lease from start to finish. So, buying versus renting. For those who prefer to rent as a tenant from a landlord or another physician, one benefit includes flexibility in the amount of time in one space. A physician could choose to be in a location for as little as 1 year term or as long as a 5-year term. This flexibility could be important if the physician wishes to expand into a new location at a later date. The tenant can simply relocate at the end of the lease term. There are also less upfront capital that is needed to rent space. Usually the tenant only pays a deposit first and last month's rent plus a few fees, which are spelled out in the lease agreement. However, depending on the condition of the space and specific practice needs of the physician, some tenants may have to pay a tenant improvement cost, which can be expensive depending on the improvement need. For example, changing out carpet for wood or laminate. This can increase the upfront capital required considerably unless the physician considers a benefit to paying a tenant improvement cost that is tax deductible. Finally, if negotiated correctly, leasing can allow tenants to move towards ownership later by way of a purchase option, right of first refusal, or offer. A right of first refusal means that if the current space becomes available for purchase, the current tenant is given the first right to make an offer. There are also downsides to renting, one of which is that the tenant is in a contractual business relationship with the landlord, which gives the tenant lack of control. The landlord could refuse to renew the tenant's lease or lease a nearby space to a physician's competitor. Second, a landlord can create a bad leasing experience. Third, there is no long-term financial investment. The tenant does not accumulate equity, nor do assets appreciate. The tenant do not own the asset, which is the building or space itself, which has value at the end of the lease. So once the lease is completed, any improvement investments cannot be gained back. Finally, renting can be cost ineffective over time. Tenants tend to have a higher ongoing cost of occupancy than owners due to rising rental rates over time. If a tenant decides to leave the lease early, then the tenant is stuck with paying penalties and the balance of the lease obligation. For those physicians who want to own their own office space and or become the landlord, the greatest benefits include a financial investment with several great opportunities. There's a potential for additional rental revenue from third-party tenants, like other physicians or ancillary services, which will lower the overall cost. There are potential tax benefits, including writing off the value of the building on your taxes. Once the real estate is paid off, and then there is marketable asset which will continue to generate revenue over time, known as equity building. Purchasing your own space allows for autonomy from other property entities like hospitals and the ability to control the space and tenant mix. Finally, purchasing can be cheaper than renting in some cases when interest rates are low and the tax benefits depreciation accrue over time. However, there can be some downsides when purchasing office space. There are more financial risks, especially in a volatile real estate market. There are higher upfront costs in equity investments in the property and any improvement costs. You're also responsible for any risks such as structural deficiencies or major building system replacements like heating and air conditioning. This means that this is a long-term commitment for the landowner or landlord. Finally, physicians are not full-time businessmen, so it's easy to take advantage of without the proper investment knowledge. Proper management of real estate requires time, expertise, and resources, which can be a distraction from the practice of medicine, meaning less time in the office or having to hire property managers, accounting, maintenance staff, and legal counsel, which will add the cost of owning the real estate over time. So now for some self-reflection. The purpose of this manual is to provide step-by-step instructions for obtaining the lease or financial purchase. So let's reflect. Ask yourself, what is your current situation? Are you brand new to practice, or are you already an established practice that is looking to relocate? Or are you leaving a practice and going out on your own? In the majority of the cases, it tends to be the latter. Once you have done self-reflection on your current practice space, you need to figure out what are your primary needs for your new space. The primary need is exam space and office space. You need to consider your current patient panel and your daily patient load and flow. Usually there are 3 exam rooms per physician, so you need to have at least the rooms available for full-time physicians or maybe 2 for part-time physicians. Your office staff also needs space. Usually you need 1 desk surface per employee if they are full-time. You can consider sharing desk space for part-time employee or have 1 desk per 2 employees to equal 1 full-time employee. Finally, if you are a physician with partners or an advanced practitioner, you need to consider if each provider has to have an office to themselves, which is around 100 square foot per provider, or do you want to share a common office space? And finally, your patients. The waiting rooms need to have 2 chairs per exam room in the waiting area. Next, consider your secondary needs. This will include a lab, storage space, and other ancillary services such as a procedure room, x-ray, and even the break room. Remember that you will have to stay within OSHA requirements and will need to be considered within your practice. Next, start thinking about the total space needed. You'll usually need about 1,000 square feet per provider on the inside, and on the outside, you'll need at least 1 parking space per 200 square feet on the inside. Start totaling up these numbers together, and this will be considered for the square footage cost of your purchase or your rent. Try to stay within your budget and try not to go over. Consider this your buffer. Find out what you're already paying and try to keep the square foot amount that you're paying currently within or below the new purchase or your new rent. However, if you are a growing practice in need of more space, you might consider going up a little bit above your budget to make room for the growing changes. Once you have an idea of the space that you need, you'll need to talk to a commercial real estate broker who is vested in medical office space. Start talking to him about your current needs and what you're looking for in the future. He's going to ask you a series of questions to make your transition to your new office space a little more easier by asking questions so that he or she knows what he needs to be looking for when searching for office space for you. This includes, do you need more or less or equal amount of space? What is your budget for your new space? What is your financial strength? When do you want to move? When do you need the new space? How many employees will you have? What kind of improvements and amenities are needed? How much parking is required? Do you have any special transportation needs? Who will make the decisions? Who can sign a lease, and where is this person located? Where do you want to locate and why? When can you see the space? Are you interested in renting, purchasing, or rent to buy? When does your current lease expire? How long have you been in your current space? What is your current rent? And are you interested in new space? Once you have answered these questions, your next thought is going to be on location. Do you want to be in the medical district or in the hospital? If you currently round at hospitals, you're going to want to stay close by, especially since most credentialing departments in hospitals require you to be within a certain radius. However, do keep in mind that real estate around hospitals tend to be more expensive. If not, do you want to consider being in a community where you're near your patient's work or home? If that is the case, then make sure that you're close by ancillary services like freestanding labs or radiology suites, especially if you're not going to provide these services. Next, know your budget. This is a commercial real estate purchase, so there is very little wiggle room when it comes to stretching the budget. Your commercial real estate broker will try to make sure that your location or your place that you are looking at will stay within those guidelines. Make a table of different places that you're considering and to weigh the pros and cons of each site. Try to see as many places in one day, so this way everything can be fresh on your mind when you're having to go back to narrow it down to one location. Finally, ask your broker for a neighborhood analysis, especially the places that you're looking at. This is going to look at transportation, parking, proximity to businesses like hospitals, labs, nursing homes, radiology suites, and other primary care offices. It'll also look at the physical address of the building itself. In other words, is it going to be a name of a street that people will recognize? Also, we'll look at improvements to the buildings and new constructions in the area, or renovations to your building or any of the current buildings around the site. When you do your final site selection, keep in mind that the Real Estate Management Journal, Property Management, says that the majority of all businesses consider cost over accessibility, environment, and even labor markets. Remember, there are multiple things to consider, so keep everything in mind and try to narrow everything down to the best fit that's going to be right for you and your practice. If you're looking to purchase, you might want to know the BOMA classification of the building. BOMA stands for Business Owners and Managers Association International. The classification can determine the resale value of the property later, as well as current cost in terms of constructions, repair, and maintenance. There are 4 classes. Class A is relatively new prime location with a high occupancy rate, rental rates that are high but competitive. Class B is an older but fully renovated to modern standards. It's in a prime location with high occupancy and competitive rates. A new building that's in a non-prime area could also be considered a Class B. A Class C is an older renovated building that's in fairly good condition. It has a good occupancy, possibly slightly lower than city average rates, and the rental rates are moderate to low. Finally, a Class D is a building which has reached the end of its functional life, is in poor condition with low rental rates and occupancy. Next step, calculations. Now that you have found your property, it's time to consider the cost. You're probably wondering how do landlords even come up with the rent calculations in the first place, so let's go over a few terms. There is the construction area, which is the finished area of the permanent outside building structure. This includes all enclosed floors, basements, equipment, floors, and penthouse if applicable. There is the rentable area, which includes any room necessary for the operation of the building. Finally, there is the usable area, which is the number of square feet that can actually be occupied. This does not include core portions like the corridors, lobbies, restrooms, equipment rooms, etc. It is important to know these areas because this is what is used to calculate the rates. The landlord is going to have a minimum rent that they're going to charge, which is not the final rent amount. The minimum rate is the operating expenses, mortgage payments, and owner's return on equity divided by the rentable area of the building. The base rate is calculated by the square footage that is being rented over a 12-month period, plus operating expenses, electrical, and janitorial. If you decide to purchase the office, the expenses are the same. When you rent, the base rate is paid to the landlord, including the taxes and operating expenses. If you buy, the base rate is the mortgage payment to the bank. Let's calculate the numbers using an example. Let's look at the numbers with an example. You're looking at a building near the hospital in Fort Worth, Texas. It is approximately 2,248 square feet. The landlord is going to charge $14 per square foot plus $6.50 triple net, which is the operating expenses, taxes, electrical, and janitorial. This comes out to $20.50 per square foot. You decided you can probably get 15 years out of the building, and you decide to do a 5-year lease. You also have the option to purchase the space, and the purchase price is $484,621.25 with a 15-year loan at 5% interest. If you decide to rent, Your monthly rent will be $3,840.33 a month, which is 2,248 square feet multiplied by $20.50 per square foot, all divided by 12 months, or $46,084 a year. Plus, you have to pay the one-time upfront costs, which include $19,915.53. In this upfront cost include the broker fee for finding the space, which is a portion of the year's rent, which comes out to $13,825.20. This also includes inspections, which need to be done, averaging about $1,250 for the square footage, attorney fees to review your lease, which is $1,000, and finally, you have to pay the deposit, which is the first month's rent at $3,840.33. If you decide to buy, you'll have to start paying the bank a due diligence fee of assuming $10,000, which will be factored back into the loan amount. Since you have to put up a down payment of 20%, the cost for the down payment is $96,924.25. You will also have to pay closing costs for the purchase, which is about $14,538.64. Your final loan amount comes out to $402,235.64 that you will pay over a 15-year period. This will make your mortgage payments to be around $3,394 a month, or $40,728 a year. After reviewing the numbers, you decide to rent the property. This means that you will have to review and sign a lease agreement. For the sake of this project, we will be looking at a commercial lease agreement from the Texas Association of Realtors. A real estate broker will help you with the leasing process. However, remember, a real estate broker cannot provide legal advice, surveys, tax advice, or environmental and structural studies. Fortunately, the landlord will provide all of these services for you. However, at any point during the lease process, if there are any questions, please consult an attorney before signing the lease agreement. So now let's begin looking in detail at the lease agreement. Parties. The parties to the lease include the tenant and the landlord. The tenant can be the physician or physician group. For legal purposes, some people list an LLC or limited liability company as the tenant, which has some advantages. If you belong to a multi-specialty physician group where there are multiple owners, the multi-specialty physician group signs a lease, and the physician group will have to sublease to the individual physician or physicians. Please talk to your physician group for details. Lease premises. Here, the lease will describe one or two types of options for lease premises: a multi-tenant property, where you might lease a suite or unit, or a single-tenant property, where you would lease the entire building. In this portion of the lease will also mention property. Property means a building or complex in which the lease premises are located, inclusive of any common areas, drives, parking areas, and walks. Terms. The terms of leases can go anywhere from 12 months to 5 years. There are pros and cons to different lease terms. Short-term leases give physicians flexibility in the time they can stay within a property, but the rent amounts tend to be higher. Long-term leases can mean cheaper rates, but does not give the physician flexibility to leave sooner if necessary. There are 2 dates that are important to remember: the commencement date, which is the first date that the lease agreement begins, but does not necessarily mean the same date that you move in, and the expiration date, which is the last date of the lease agreement, which also does not necessarily mean the day you move out. Delay of occupancy. If you cannot occupy the building at the specified commencement date, there is a delay of occupancy. If the reason for the delay is because of either construction on the leased premises that has not been substantially completed by the landlord, or a prior tenant is still holding over the leased premises, the landlord will not be liable to the tenant for such a delay, and the lease will remain enforceable. If this occurs, the commencement date will automatically be extended to the date that the tenant is able to occupy the property, and the expiration date can also be extended by a like number of days, so that the length of the lease remains unchanged. If the tenant is unable to occupy the leased premise after the 90th day after the commencement date because of incomplete construction, or if the previous tenant is still occupying the leased premises, the tenant may terminate the lease by giving written notice to the landlord before the leased premises become available to be occupied by the tenant, and the landlord will refund to the tenant any amounts paid to the landlord by the tenant. Note that does not apply to cleanings or repairs. Rent and expenses. The base monthly rent is due on or before the first date of the month, or a date determined by the landlord, which will be written in the lease. There can be a prorated rate for the first month's rent that has to be paid on a date other than the first month or date written in the lease. The prorated rate is the amount equal to the base monthly rent multiplied by the following fraction: the number of days from the commencement date to the first day of the following month divided by the number of days in the month in which the lease commences. The prorated rate is due on or before the commencement date. There are additional rents on separate addendums that are added to some commercial leases. One addendum is the commercial expense reimbursement addendum. This addendum can break down the specific portions of the operating expenses or the triple net. If you are agreeing to pay the triple net in its entirety, then you will not need this addendum. Other addendums include a commercial percentage rent addendum, which is usually not applicable for medical real estate leases, and a commercial parking addendum, which defines the spaces that can be utilized for parking. The tenant must pay all rent on time without demand, deduction, or offset, except as permitted by law or the lease. If the tenant fails to timely pay any amounts under the lease, or if any check of the tenant is returned to the landlord by the institution from which it was drawn, the landlord will give the tenant written notice that the rent is due and may require the tenant to pay subsequent amounts via certified funds. If the landlord does not receive payment, the landlord can be entitled to turn over the tenant to collections to receive payment. If the landlord does not actually receive rent payment at the designated place within 5 days after the rent is due, the tenant will have to pay the landlord a late charge equal to 5%. 5% is usually the standard in Texas, but can change pending the landlord's preference. The payment must be given directly to the landlord, preferably face-to-face, but can be delivered by other means, including mail or electronic transfer. Security deposit. The tenant has to pay security deposit to secure the space. The security deposit is usually equal to the first month's rent. The landlord may apply the security deposit to any amounts owed by the tenant under the lease. The landlord can apply the security deposit to damages or late payments. If the amounts are more than security deposit, the tenant has to pay the difference within 10 days of receiving a notice from the landlord. The landlord refunds the security deposit minus any charges owed by the tenant within 60 days after the tenant leaves the premises. Taxes. The landlord pays the taxes using the amount from the triple net. Utilities. The responsibilities of utility services can vary in agreement between the tenant, the landlord, and or third parties, like a multi-specialty group. The usual utilities in question include water, sewage, electric, gas, telephone, trash, cable, janitorial services. The responsible party pays directly to the utility service provider. The responsible party may select the utility service provider, except that if the tenant selects a provider, any access or alterations to their property or lease premises necessary for the utilities may be made only with the landlord's prior consent, and the landlord can legally withhold. If the landlord incurs any liability for utility or connection charges that is really the responsibility of the tenant, and the landlord pays for the charges, the tenant must, upon written notice from the landlord, reimburse the landlord for the amount of the charges. For example, if the cable company has to do minor construction to lay additional wiring for an electronic medical record system in the building, and the landlord pays for the connection charges and construction charges, the tenant is responsible for reimbursing the landlord. Therefore, the tenant should determine if all necessary utilities are available to the leased premises prior to move-in and are adequate for the tenant's intended use before signing the lease. The one spot in the lease that is tricky is the HVAC charges. HVAC means heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. Because HVAC issues don't necessarily occur during business hours, there can be specified responsibilities for payments in the lease. The landlord can provide HVAC services during business hours only. The tenant can pay for HVAC services needed during and outside operating business hours. Insurance. During all times that the lease is in effect, the tenant at their expense must purchase an insurance policy from an insurer authorized to operate in Texas. It has to include public liability insurance in an amount not less than $1 million on an occurrence basis, naming the landlord as an additional insured. The policy must also provide personal property damage insurance for the tenant's business operations and contents on the leased premises in an amount sufficient to replace the contents after a casualty loss. Before the commencement date, the tenant must provide the landlord a copy of insurance certificates showing the required coverage. If the insurance coverage is renewed or changes in any manner or degree at any time the lease is in effect, the tenant must provide the landlord a copy of an insurance certificate showing the renewal or change within 10 days. If the tenant fails to maintain the required insurance in full force and effect at all times the lease is in effect, the landlord can choose to purchase insurance that will provide the same coverage as the required insurance, and the tenant must immediately reimburse the landlord. Otherwise, the tenant will go into default. Use and hours. This is a medical office space and should be used for such. The hours of the practice are specified in this area. If the physician is in a multi-tenant building, the property is to post their hours of operations here. Legal compliance. The space should be used for medical office purposes only, and it's up to the physician to independently verify and not rely on the landlord to assume that the space can be used for medical purposes. This is where zoning comes in, and it is important. You can always talk to the local county office to make sure that the space is zoned for medical office use. If you are around other medical offices, most likely you are. In this portion of the lease will mention a list of things that you have to make sure you are not doing, and they are located here. Most medical offices do not have these issues, but once again, make sure to read the lease carefully. You cannot have 1. Any activity which is a nuisance or is offensive, noisy, or dangerous. 2. Any activity that interferes with any other tenant's normal business operations or landlord management of the property. 3. Any activity that violates any applicable law, regulation, zoning ordinance, restrictive covenant, governmental order, owners association rules, tenant association rules, pending it's a multi-tenant property, landlord rules or regulations for the lease. 4. Any hazardous activity that would require any insurance premium on the property or lease premises to increase or that would void any such insurance. 5. Any activity that violates any applicable state, federal, or local law, including but not limited to those laws that relate to air quality, water quality, hazardous materials, wastewater, waste disposal, air emissions, or other environmental matters. 6. The permanent or temporary storage of any hazardous waste. Since most physician offices have biohazard waste, you will need to make special arrangements with a waste disposal company and notify the landlord of such an arrangement. Signs. Any and all signs on the leased premises require the landlord's written consent. Some landlords have a signage company that they work with to provide signage. If the sign is not approved by the landlord may remove any unauthorized sign, and the tenant will promptly reimburse the landlord for the cost of removing the unauthorized sign. All signs must comply with all laws, restrictions, zoning ordinances, and any governmental order relating to signs on the leased premises or property. The landlord may temporarily remove any authorized sign to complete repairs or alterations to the leased premises or property. By providing written notice to the tenant before the lease ends, the landlord may require the tenant, upon move-out and at the tenant's expense, to remove without damage to the property or leased premises any or all signs that were placed on the property or leased premises by or at the request of the tenant. Any signs that the landlord does not require the tenant to remove and that are fixtures become the property of the landlord and must be surrendered to the landlord at the time the lease ends. Access by the landlord. During the tenant's normal business hours, the landlord may enter the leased premises for any reasonable purpose, including but not limited to purposes for repairs, maintenance, alterations, and showing the leased premises to prospective tenants or purchasers of the property. Most landlords will respect HIPAA laws and will usually notify the physician prior to arrival or try to enter the premises when patients are not there. The landlord can have access to the leased premises after the tenant's normal business hours if the entry is necessary to complete emergency repairs. The landlord cannot unreasonably interfere with the tenant's business operations when accessing the leased premises. Therefore, please keep all information HIPAA compliant at all times. Towards the end of the lease agreement, the landlord can place a for lease sign within a specified amount of time. Move-in condition. Very important. This part of the lease states that the tenant has inspected the leased premises and accepted it in its present condition unless otherwise noted in the lease. Move-out condition and forfeiture of tenant's personal property. At the time that the lease ends, the tenant will surrender or vacate the premises and return all keys and access devices the leased premises in the same condition as when they received, except for normal wear and tear, which is deterioration that occurs without negligence. Move-out condition and forfeiture of tenant's personal property. At the time that the lease ends, the tenant will surrender the leased premises in the same condition as when received, except for normal wear and tear. The tenant will leave the leased premises in a clean condition, free of all trash, debris, personal property, hazardous materials, and environmental contaminants. Have janitorial services do a thorough final clean after all personal items and equipment have been vacated from the property. If the tenant leaves any personal property in the leased premises behind after vacating the leased premises, the landlord can do one or two things. He or she can require the tenant at the tenant's expense to remove the personal property after providing written notice to the tenant, or he or she can retain such personal property as forfeiting property to the landlord. The landlord will also require the tenant to remove without damage to the property or leased premises any or all fixtures that were placed on the property or leased premises by or at the request of the tenant. The landlord will notify the tenant of this need in writing, and the tenant will need to remove the fixtures at their own expense. Any fixtures that the landlord does not require the tenant to remove become the property of the landlord. Maintenance and repairs. The tenant must keep the leased premises clean and sanitary. The tenant must also promptly dispose of all garbage in appropriate receptacles. Either the landlord or the tenant will provide, at his or her own expense, janitorial services. Biohazard disposal is something separate and usually the responsibility of the tenant. Check with your janitorial services to see if they provide biohazard disposal, as not all companies provide this service, and you might need a separate service provider. Each party must promptly repair a condition in need of repair that is caused either intentionally or negligently by that party or that party's staff, patients, invitees, contractors, or permitted subtenants. There is a portion of the lease where the maintenance and repair of specified items in the leased premises is listed and broken down to decide which party is responsible for which item. The tenant is responsible for the repair and maintenance of their own personal property. Repairs must be completed by trained, qualified, and insured repaired persons. The landlord is usually responsible for the repair and maintenance of anything structural. Their specified items can include, but are not limited to, foundation, exterior walls, roofs, and other structural components, usually the responsibility of the landlord, glass and windows. This can be the responsibility of the tenant if the tenant causes damage either intentionally or non-intentionally. Fire protection, equipment, and fire sprinklers, usually the responsibility of the landlord. Exterior and overhead doors, including closure devices, molding locks, and hardware. This can be the responsibility of the tenant if the tenant caused the damage either intentionally or non-intentionally. Ground maintenance, including landscaping and irrigation system. This can be a shared item between the landlord and the tenant. Interior doors, including closures, devices, frames, molding, locks, and hardware. This can be the responsibility of the tenant if the tenant caused the damage either intentionally or non-intentionally. Parking areas and walks. This is usually the responsibility of the landlord, but is covered under the triple net. Plumbing systems, drainage systems, electrical systems, and mechanical systems, except systems or items specifically designed otherwise, like a personal security alarm. This is usually the responsibility of the landlord and is covered under the triple net. Ballast and lamp replacements. This is usually the responsibility of the landlord. Heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, or HVAC. This has already been covered under the lease earlier. Sign and lighting, including pylons, fascia, monuments, and doors or suites. This also has been already covered under the lease agreement earlier. Extermination and pest control, excluding wood-destroying insects. This can be a shared expense unless covered under the triple net. Fences and gates, usually the responsibility of the landlord. Storage yards and storage buildings, this can be a shared item. Wood-destroying insect treatment, also known as termites and repairs. This is usually the responsibility of the landlord. Cranes and related systems, usually the responsibility of the landlord. And other items and systems, that is a shared item. The tenant may or may not be required to maintain, at his or her own expense, a regularly scheduled maintenance and service contract for the HVAC system. The maintenance and service contract must be purchased from an HVAC maintenance company that regularly provides such contracts to similar properties. If the tenant fails to maintain a required HVAC maintenance and service contract in effect at all times, alterations. The tenant may not alter, improve, or add to the property of the leased premises without the landlord's written consent. The landlord will not unreasonably withhold consent for the tenant to make reasonable, non-structural alterations, modifications, or improvements on the leased premises. This means you can paint an accent wall or hang pictures. However, the tenant may not alter any locks or security devices on the property or the leased premises without the landlord's consent. If the landlord authorizes the changing, addition, or rekeying of any locks or other security devices, the tenant must immediately deliver the new keys and access devices to the landlord. If a governmental order requires alteration or modification to the leased premises, the responsible party, either the landlord or the tenant, is responsible financially for the repair and maintenance. Any alterations, improvements, fixtures, or addition to the property or leased premises installed by either party during the term of the lease will become the landlord's property and must be surrendered to the landlord at the time the lease ends. Except for those fixtures the landlord requires the tenant to remove, or if the parties agree otherwise in writing. Liens. A lien is a notice stating that you owe someone money. Usually the best way to avoid this is by paying the rent on time. A tenant may not do anything that will cause the title of the property or leased premises to be encumbered in any way. If the tenant causes a lien to be filed against the property or leased premises, the tenant will, within 20 days, after receipt of the landlord's demand, must either pay the lien, have the lien released from record, or take the action to discharge the lien. Liens usually go through some financial institution, like a bank or credit union. The tenant will provide a copy of such action to the landlord. Liability. This portion of the lease relates to injuries occurred to actual people. To the extent permitted by law, the landlord is not responsible to the tenant or tenant's employees, patients, guests, or invitees for any damages, injuries, or losses to person or property caused by an act, omission, or neglect of the tenant's agent, the tenant's guests, the tenant's employees, the tenant's patients, the tenant's invitees, or any other tenant on the property, or fire, flood, water leaks, ice, snow, hail, winds, explosion, smoke, riot, strike, interruption of utilities, theft, burglary, robbery, assault, vandalism, other persons, environmental contaminants, or other occurrences or casualty losses. Indemnity. Each party will protect one another from loss of damage and hold the other party harmless for any property damage, personal injury, suits, actions, liabilities, damages, costs of repair or service to the leased premises or property, or any other loss caused negligently or otherwise by that party or party's employees, patients, guests, or invitees. Default. Default is the failure to fulfill an obligation or promise or to perform specific acts. If the landlord fails to comply with the lease within 30 days after the tenant notifies the landlord or the landlord's failure to comply, the landlord will be in default, and the tenant may seek any action to remedy the problem provided by law. If, however, the landlord's non-compliance reasonably requires more than 30 days to cure, the landlord will not be in default if the cure is commenced within the 30-day period and diligently pursued. If the landlord does not actually receive payment for any rent due under the lease within 5 days after it is due, the tenant will be in default. If the tenant fails to comply with the lease for any other reason within 10 days after the landlord notifies the tenant of his or her failure to comply, the tenant will be in default. If the tenant is in default, the landlord may terminate the tenant's right to occupy the leased premises by providing the tenant with at least 3 days written notice and accelerate all rents which are paid during the remainder of the lease or any renewal period without notice or demand. The landlord will attempt to mitigate any damages or loss caused by the tenant's breach by using commercially reasonable means. If the tenant is in default, the tenant will be liable for any lost rent, the landlord's cost of relocating the leased premises, including brokerage fees, advertising fees, and other fees necessary to relet the leased premises, repairs to the leased premises for use beyond normal wear and tear, all the landlord's costs associated with collection of rent, such as collection fees, late charges, and return check charges, cost of removing any of the tenant's equipment or fixtures left on the leased premises or property, cost to remove any trash, debris, personal property, hazardous materials, or environmental contaminants left by the tenant or the tenant's employees, patients, guests, or invitees in the leased premises or property, cost to replace any unreturned keys or access devices to the leased premises, parking area, or property, and any other recoveries to which the landlord may be entitled under the lease or law. Abandonment, interruption of utilities, removal of property, and lockout. Chapter 93 of the Texas Property Code governs the right and obligations of the parties with regard to abandonment of the leased premises, interruption of utilities, removal of the tenant's property, and lockout of the tenant. It is about 9 pages long, but it is public record if you Google Chapter 93 of the Texas Property Code. Holdover. This applies to a tenant who remains occupied in the leased premises after the expiration of the lease. If the tenant fails to vacate the leased premises at the time the lease ends, the tenant will become a tenant at will and must vacate the leased premises immediately upon receipt of demand from the landlord. No holding over by the tenant, with or without the consent of the landlord, will extend the lease. The tenant will compensate the landlord and any prospective tenants for any and all damages caused by the holdover. The rent for any holdover period will be 2 times the base monthly rent, plus any additional rent calculated on a daily basis and will be immediately due and payable daily without notice or demand. Landlord's lien and security interest. To secure the tenant's performance under the lease, the tenant grants to the landlord a lien and security interest against all of the tenant's non-exempt personal property that is in the leased premises or property. In the event that the tenant ever goes into default, the landlord can seize the personal property in the leased premises and sell the equipment to pay for expenses like back rent. Assignment and subletting. The assignment of a lease is a transfer of rights to use the leased property. Assignment and subletting. The assignment of a lease is the transfer of rights to use the leased property. An example of this would be if the landlord were to sell the property to another person or company. The landlord may assign the lease to that person or company. Subletting is when a lease goes from one tenant to another tenant. An example of this would be if the physician transferred the lease to another physician due to retirement, illness, move to another location, or transfer of practice. The tenant may not assign the lease or sublet any part of the lease premises without the landlord's written consent. Purchasing. After you reviewed the numbers, you decided to go ahead and purchase a building rather than rent. Unless you have a pile of money, you're going to need to go to your local bank and ask for a loan. Be very specific for the amount that you're going to want to request and the purposes of the loan. Start gathering your information. The bank will need 2 to 3 years of previous business financial statements, including balance sheets and income statements. They will also need 2 to 3 years of corporate tax returns. Finally, they will need the current interim business financial statements, including the current balance sheet and income statements, usually for the current quarter's end. If you are a new physician or currently still in residency and do not have previous business statements, look into getting a small business association loan and ask about startup programs from your bank. You can also look into purchasing an existing practice, which can help build collateral for future purposes. Make sure to keep a good credit history and save as much money as possible. Finally, gather up your personal financials. The bank is going to want a current personal financial statement for each owner or guarantor, as well as 2 to 3 years of past personal tax returns for each owner or guarantor. The bank will also want to know about any outstanding debt in those terms. Once you present your personal and business financials, the bank will take this information to committee to review and determine if they can approve you for a loan. There are several things that the banks look for when determining if they can approve you for a loan. First, they want to know your ability to pay off the debt. They will look at what's called the debt service coverage ratio. This is your earnings before interest, depreciation, and amortization, also known as EBITDA, divided by the principal and interest paid on any new or existing debt. The higher the ratio, the better. Second, they want to know the entire health of the practice. The more revenue the practice brings in, the better. Next, they look at the type and value of collateral the borrower already owns. You need a satisfactory personal credit score and history. Banks usually look at the past 3 years. You need sufficient personal cash flow to support a personal debt. The banks look at the amount of cash the physician can inject into the financing. Banks do not normally finance 100%. You'll need a good personal balance sheet. Finally, the more years in practice, the better. This shows longevity of the investment. If the bank approves you for a loan, they will give you a term sheet explaining the loan. For the purposes of educating a physician looking to purchase their own office space, I have included the most likely type of loan information issued, which will include 1, the borrower. This can be either the physician or the physician's LLC or limited liability company. An LLC is a business structure that can combine the income flow of a sole proprietorship or a partnership with the limited liability of a corporation. The LLC allows for flexibility in legal matters. For example, if damage to the building causes injury to a person, the injured person can sue the LLC and not the physician, allowing the physician to protect his or her assets. An accountant can prepare the documents and file them with the state to set up an LLC. 2, the lender. The lender will be any FDIC certified bank or credit union. 3, the facility amount. This is where the total loan amount goes. This will be the cost of the building minus the down payment. 4, facility type. For physicians who are purchasing the office for their own medical practice, the facility type will be an owner-occupied real estate loan. 5, the purpose, which is usually the same as the facility type. 6 is the interest rate. There are 2 types of interest rates, fixed and variable. A fixed interest rate is one that does not change over the course of the loan period. A variable interest rate is one that will either go up or down over time. All interest rates are based on a floor or a baseline based on an index. The type of index will be listed in this portion of the term sheet. The types of indexes include one of 3: U.S. Treasury yield, the Wall Street Journal prime rate, or the London Interbank Offered rate. Ask your banker about getting the lower of these 3 rates. 7. Maturity rate. Maturity is the due date of the loan. The term of the loan can be anywhere from 1 year to 15 years, but they tend to be shorter than residential loans. A loan that has a very long lifespan that matures slowly over time to the point that the loan balance is reduced to 0 is referred to as a fully amortized or self-amortized. A loan that has a very long lifespan that matures slowly over time to the point that the loan balance is reduced to 0 is referred to as a fully amortizing or self-amortizing loan. A loan that has a short lifespan and matures abruptly is a term loan. Term loans are not self-amortizing and require a large lump sum payment at the end of the maturity period called the balloon payment. 8. Repayment. This says you will pay the mortgage, principal, and interest rates on a monthly basis to the lender. 9. A guarantor. This is where the person or persons' names would be included. 10. Collateral. Here is the property address that will be purchased within the loan. 11. Covenants. For physicians, the covenant that banks worry about with any service provider is the ability to have a high debt service coverage ratio, or DSCR. This is calculated by taking the earnings before interest, depreciation, amortization, and rent, or EBITDA for short, for your practice, plus your annual cash flow, all divided by the principal and interest on the loan. The higher the ratio, the better. 12. Reporting requirements. Here it is saying that you will give the bank every year a copy of your tax returns, an updated personal financial statement, and an annual compliance certificate. The bank or credit union will furnish the compliance certificate for you. The best advice would be to keep a copy of your personal financial statement on a shared drive and update it on a continuous basis to save time. For the tax returns, you usually have until November to turn those into the bank. 13. Other conditions. This is a very generalized section and will be lender and loan specific. 14. Expenses and fees. This includes all legal fees, appraisals, surveys, inspections. Now that you have agreed to the term sheet, the bank will send off this information for its final approval. Once it's approved, it will go over to the title company for the final paperwork. This paperwork will need to be signed during normal business hours. Unfortunately, the dates and times are usually not notified to the physician until a few days prior, so you will have to adjust your office hours accordingly to adjust for patient flow. Once you're at the title company, you will need to provide a check for the closing costs that will be signed over to the title company. It'll take a few hours, so like I said, plan your day accordingly. Once all the paperwork is signed and you've handed over your check, the purchase of your building is now complete. However, if for whatever reason you are unable to get a loan from your bank or credit union, there are other options, including looking at life insurance policies that can also substantiate for a loan as well. That will also help with the purchase. That will also help with the purchasing process too. So this concludes my presentation. I'd like to thank Tom Mitchell from Mitchell Realty Group, Wendy Washington from Plains Capital Bank, Kimball Ramey, Certified Public Accountants, Tiara Burns and Dr. Sarah Holmes from the UNT Dallas campus for helping put together this video. And also I'd like to thank the Texas Academy of Family Physicians for allowing me to participate in their leadership experience.